Well, hello, and welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I'm Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, you can get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Feel free to send me any questions, comments, any ideas for future interviews. I'd love to hear from you. Now, today's conversation is all about the editorial process, UX experience, and content modeling, which is very near and dear to my heart, as you know, with my guest, Michael Andrews. He's the Content Strategy Evangelist for Kontent by Kentico. Now, before we get started, I'm going to tell you real quick about headlesscreator.com and why you need your free account. Go get your free account. For those of you watching live, if you already have an account, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. But if you don't get your free account, you'll have access to this interview on demand in about an hour after we're done with the live version. But not only that, you'll have access to all of the interviews, and you'll have access to all of the content on the site, including all the courses, Content Modeling Weekly, Discover Headless Tech course, and interviews, all of the Headless CMS courses. We have tons of them, bootcamp courses, and we have much more coming up soon. So go get your free account. You're not going to regret it. If you already have one, thank you so much. And just a reminder, you can listen to the podcast audio version also on Apple Podcasts. And thank you for watching and listening here live. Now, with that said, no more marketing. What we're going to go ahead and do now. Oh, by the way, for those of you listening live, of course, in the chat, go ahead and type questions. If you have any questions for Michael, our guest, I will go ahead and ask them for you. Now, having said that, let's bring on Michael. Michael, welcome.
Hi, Marcelo. Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
Glad to have you here. This isn't the first time we speak, but definitely on air. So Thank you for joining me. Had some great conversations, and you create some great content out there, and we're going to talk about that soon. But let's just start by just introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how you got into technology, headless, CMSs, and all that kind of stuff.
Sure. So I've really started my career many years ago working with structured content. I was what was called a technical information specialist who was doing online research around technology and patents and things like that. So the paradigm of structured content was impressed on me very early on. I then got interested in how the web was turning out and the need to think about the human-computer interaction there. So I studied that. I've worked as an information architect, thinking about how to present information on the front end. But for the past dozen years or so, I've worked as a content strategist in various capacities, helping organizations to think about how they manage their content. And for the past 3 years, I've been a content strategy evangelist at Kontent by Kentico, which, as you know, is a headless vendor. And I've been deeply involved with thinking about how headless can support authors and content creators. So that's my story.
Well, a couple of things on that. Number one, we have a course on Headless Creator called Focus on Content, so go check that out. But number two, I love that you say the paradigm of, because I think, and we're going to touch upon that, but it's a new paradigm that people need to get used to and understand, right? So we're going to be touching upon that pretty soon. So why don't we jump in and just start about content modeling? Like, give a quick overview for those that don't know. I mean, many people know, but what is content modeling and why is that so important?
Yeah, so content models are often thought of as being like a data model in some way, and some people will even say content is data. But I really look at it a little bit differently. I see the content has editorial characteristics to it. Whether you're creating a message or a description or whatever it is, it has an editorial intent to it. So it's really important to think about the role of the content model as it relates to the people creating the content, the authors and others, as well as the people who the content is being delivered to, the end users. And the content model really is that in between those two groups of people. And it is really guiding what content gets created, and is guiding what content gets delivered. So it has a hugely important role, and it's really important that we plan the content model in the right way, because I personally believe that the quality of your content model ultimately influences the quality of the content that's created.
I'm glad you're talking about content authors, because I think industry wide, the focus, specifically with headless CMSs, has always been developer, right? I mean, that's the
Mm.
whole how headless became popular, is because we wanted to separate that front end and make it easy for developers to choose whatever technology. But I think a certain portion of people were not really included in how this works, which is the authors. Right now, it's changing in everywhere, right? But that is so important too when you're creating your content model, that it isn't just your developer creating this, right? That you've got to involve your authors and their way of thinking and their workflows. So talk a little bit more about that, about the team, like. And we're going to jump into, because you mentioned how the content model influences content. That's really important. But I want to talk about a little bit about a team. Like when you're creating a content model, who should be involved in that team?
Yeah, I think it's important to involve a diverse group of people who will be using the content model in some way. Obviously, it is uh, determining what the implementation of your content management system. So we need to have authors involved. We need to have content managers involved, people who do sort of the maintenance type of work around the content. We need to have SEO people involved because they have their requirements. And I also believe it's important to have UX people involved, and that I may be a little different than other people in that regard. I know the content model is there to manage the content; it's not there to manage the design. But ultimately, we need to be thinking about what end users need to have, and how we structure that content in a way that is going to support the goals of end users. So they can be a very useful party to the conversation. But really, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having authors involved in the development of a content model, and maybe not even just one token author, but there's a range of content there. It has different characteristics, it has different workflows, and you need to get input from a lot of authors, because they're ultimately going to be the ones spending the most time in the CMS. So their point of view, I think, is in some ways more important than everyone else's.
I'm 100% with you on that. I mean, because at the end of the day, the developer walks away, they're done, they're moving on to a different project, and then authors have to live with this day in and day out, right? So,
Yeah.
big proponent of that for sure. Now, before you mentioned how the content model influences the uh, content quality, can you expand on that? What do you mean by that?
Well, we both know there's multiple ways you can create a content model, and there's many different considerations, and you could just let a developer do it. And a lot of organizations do that. It seems kind of technical. Just let the developer do it. Now, a developer is going to have their own point of view about this, and in my experience, they tend to want to create a very simple content model that's very abstract. They love abstraction, and their goals really are to just worry about the what the fields are, so they can query these fields, and the fewer names of fields there are, the happier they are. The view from an author is going to be very different. They are, as I said, creating an editorial content that has intent behind it, then they need to uh, be clear about what it is the structure is about. So we need their input in this, and we need to make sure that it's coherent for them. So there's two things involved with a content model, if I can simplify this. One is identifying what details are important. And then the second is, how do we group these details together in a way that makes sense in different scenarios? They could be user scenarios, they could be workflow scenarios, they could be all kinds of different scenarios. And the authors have a really key insight into both of those things, and it really influences the quality of what they're doing. So if things are too fragmented, and I think you've even talked about it on some of your programs about how you can break things apart into a zillion logical pieces, but it's suddenly the experience for creating this content scattered
It's
across multiple
horrible, right?
screens. And it's not only inefficient, but it taxes the mind. You forget what's on one screen. You don't really know how one piece of information relates to another, and is this compatible? So we need to be thinking about how these groupings will make sense to people so they can get their work done as efficiently as possible, but also as they're writing this, because ultimately this is an environment that we're creating for people to do their work. They're writing, they're commenting, they're approving. They need to see the relationships between these different pieces of content, and we want to think about the importance of grouping these things together properly, so everyone understands how the pieces will fit together.
Now, when you say grouping, you're talking about like the fields. Like, for example, if you have like address fields, how do you group them together for an easier data entry or content entry experience?
Well, that's part of it. Yeah. We can group things in different ways, and maybe there's slight differences among different vendors, CMSs. I'm not going to be, you have more expertise on the range of them than I do, but we can group things to uh, put focus on what work needs to be done. So, I mean, in our system, for example, we can create a group that's just on a different tab, and you can say, okay, only
Right.
the SEO people need to worry about this group of stuff here. We can group things that have certain permissions on them so that, all right, this field here, not anyone can edit it. It's only a certain role that can do that. So that's one kind of grouping. And then we have the kind of grouping that involves thinking about how do we break content types into the right way, and what relationships exist. Is this going to be a standalone content type, or is it a case where we have some fields that really aren't a standalone, and how do we work with that? And maybe not everyone needs to use those few fields, and so there's a lot of decisions around uh, the structuring to make it efficient so people can focus on what they need to do. And the content model is going to have lots and lots of details in it. But when you look at a content model, often it kind of looks like a big octopus when you diagram it out. And authors are kind of like, well, what do I need to worry about? And
Right.
at what point in time? So the content model itself doesn't show any movement of time. It's sort of a picture of everything at once. And when we start thinking about grouping things, then we can start thinking about different points in time when different activities are being done, and who is involved with it. So that's one of the considerations, I think, when you look at how you break this apart and put it together. I mean, we say lumping and splitting is sort of what a lot of this work is
Right.
about.
But let's talk a little about single or omni-channel delivery, right? Because I'm a huge believer of grouping and creating structures. I speak a lot about content types versus components and building structures that can be reused. But one of the problems is if you have an omni-channel strategy where you go to mobile, you go to a website, you go to, who knows, VR, you go to an IoT device,
Hmm.
then that grouping of fields may break down because it may be different groupings depending on the channel, right? Like what do you display where kind of thing, or what
Right.
do you show where kind of thing. What's your take on something like that, where you have an omni-channel strategy and you're trying to make this workflow for the editorial process work, but which workflow works for which channel? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, it's another one of these dimensions that you need to be thinking about as you're developing the content model. So I think, first of all, is there a distinct editorial workflow associated with a particular channel? Or is it is that not the case? But I how would I say about the omnichannel is? I mean, it's obviously a huge benefit of the headless approach, being able to have one source from which you can publish to many different touch points. We also know that these different touch points have what are called different affordances, so they don't all behave in the same way, say, a website does. So sometimes you need to add certain elements or attributes because of the characteristics of a particular touch point. But one of the things I think gets a little overlooked sometimes in content models is the differences in the qualities of the values that will be associated with an attribute. So there's a lot of focus in the content model about what attributes you need. And sometimes when we talk about reusing structure, I mean, especially if you're a developer, that's what you're thinking about, just reusing the attributes rather than reusing the values. And the values in the case of omnichannel sometimes may need to be slightly different. I mean, you have maybe some space constraints that are going to be there for certain channels, or you may need to come up with potentially more than one version of a value, even if it's the basic attribute is going to be the same. So,
do you have an example of that? Because I'm trying to understand what you mean by values. You mean the value of the actual field?
The value of the actual field. So, if we take a label,
I see.
and that label